We're here today to discuss Texas art, a broad topic, a topic that I think everyone in this room and on this weekend have a deep appreciation and association with. I know when I arrived in Texas a little over 3 years ago now, it became very important in my leadership at the Amon Carter to think about where we were as a relationship to what we were doing. And certainly in the realm of the display and the collecting of art, being in Texas took on a particular focus.
And one of the things that was a point of discussion even back then was, is it Texas art or is it contemporary art in Texas? And as a contemporary artist myself, I actually prefer the latter, that we are contemporary artists living in Texas. The whole notion of Texas art sometimes alludes to a certain genre of painting, which is usually thought of as like Western art. And even on the outside the state, I remember studying on a NEA panel 1993, I think, and I remember the panelists who were from places across the United States, when they realized that Texas had about 30 grant applications for visual arts organizations. They're saying, what's happening in Texas? And their idea of the art in Texas was just that was Western art. They didn't realize it was a contemporary art scene. And it doesn't mean that contemporary art excludes Western art. It's inclusive. It's more broader than that. So it can go from the kind of the concerns that happen in a regional level, but also to deal with global issues that a lot of other artists deal with. So it's a lot more inclusive than many people think when you start thinking about Texas art. Now, in the 70s in Texas, there was the notion, much more so, of Texas art, because there was, since Texas wasn't really looked at seriously as far as the art world is concerned, a lot of artists at that time were saying, well, we're just going to do what we want, and we're going to take a risk because we got nothing to lose. Nobody's going to buy our art, probably not going to show our art, so we're just going to do what we want to do. And it was a great mindset to have, and in a sense, when I was a student in the 70s, I kind of grew up with that. But you had people like Terry Allen and Jim Roche who did work that specifically where it was tied to Texas. I remember seeing a lithograph by Terry Allen, had the map of Europe, and instead of the names of the cities and towns there, from there, it took all the Texas cities and towns and put those names onto the map of Europe, which I thought was brilliant. And I thought, this is kind of like Texas art. But you have many artists here who show, I think one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, you have a lot of artists in the community and in Texas who not only show around Texas, but outside of Texas and on an international level. And sometimes we don't realize the kind of art that we're making that actually can be seen in many parts of the world, and not seen as Texas art, but being seen as contemporary art. So.
And to your point, I think one thing specifically about the 1970s, which, and you hate to put definitions on anything, but when you think of defining Texas art, you think of it as pluralism, meaning, as you said, it was that moment in the 70s where artists were saying, well, we've got nothing to lose, so we'll just, do whatever we want. But what's fascinating, I think, is in doing research right now on Everett Spruce, I found an interview from 1940 in Time magazine asking about the way he worked and what he was trying to convey, and did he feel certain pressure? And he said, working within Texas, I'm not bounded. I feel free to do what I want. So I think in part because Texas was sort of behind when you think about its cultural development. I mean, the first real university art program started by Ward Lockwood at the University of Texas, that really was 1938, that a real program. So if you look back and think about Texas history and how it evolved in terms of the arts, you've got that beginning then, and there was almost a sense of, I think, especially with the eclecticism that Ward Lockwood, sort of in choosing his professors, choosing young artists who were sort of open-minded. You think about all the artists that were there between Spruce and Kelly Fearing, sort of allowing artists an expression. So even when relating what Spruce said in 1940, I remember Jack Boynton in 1980 being interviewed and him saying something similar. Well, he said maybe the encouragement isn't quite here, but we're free to do what we want. So there has been this freedom because even art criticism, if you look at sort of all the components of a cultural development in a state, even art criticism wasn't quite there in the 70s yet. It was developing and evolving, really probably didn't get there more so to the 80s. So I think it allowed a certain freedom for artists, which is unique for Texas.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to bring up the 1970s because that was a time when Western art, sort of a resurgence, I think, in Western art. And to me, Western art really is Western art as opposed to Texas art. I think both because of my background, because my father's gallery represented the modernists, the footwear circle, and then contemporary artists and people who were better known outside of Texas, like Sharon Capriva, and some other artists. So I tend to sort of separate that. There are some, Texas artists who are Western artists as well, but to me, I kind of break it down into a few categories. You have sort of your historical, your 19th century art, your murals, your McArdles, your immigrant painters, a lot of influence from Germany and from Latin America, who, were really mid-19th century. And then you get into the Texas Impressionists and your Julian Onderdonks and all that kind of thing. That all was sort of centered around the hill country. And then you had, your regionalists who were looking to, greater American styles. And I think a lot of those I think there was a strong sort of core of those in Dallas in particular. And then you had your real modernists, and most of the artists went through these periods, like the footwear circle were very strong modernists, and then in Houston you had such a strong sort of abstract expressionist, sort of contemporary art feel. So it's rare to find Western art in a Texas art sale at auction. We really, try to focus on Texas artists who were creating works in a larger context than sort of the mythology of Texas. So
for Texas anyway, the 70s is brand new stuff as far as my collection is concerned. And I've been around Caseta long enough. Caseta is the Center for the Advancement and Study of Early Texas Art. I've been around Caseta long enough to have had this conversation or heard it many times.
should I give the definition?
I was
The
going to
definition.
say, do you have a definition?
We do.
We do.
What we have determined is that Texas art is art made by Texans or made in Texas. Now we add 40 years or more before the current date because we're looking at early Texas art. But it's as broad a definition as you can come up with, just about. But it's the only one we could come up with that seemed to satisfy almost everybody. My own personal definition is Texas art is whatever I like, but I can make a convincing enough case to convince myself that it's early Texas. We have, in our collection, we've got a number of paintings that Emma Richardson Cherry, some people up here have said they don't know who she is. We'll talk about that later. I'm sure they were joking. A number of paintings that she did in the 1880s in Giverny, long before she had ever come to Texas, actually not that long, only 7 or 8 years before she had ever come to Texas, which we consider early Texas art because she did come to Texas, she spent 60 years here and had an incredibly important impact on Texas, and those paintings lived almost their entire life in Texas, and they also had an impact on Texas. Now I know that's stretching by some people's definition, and that's why we have that broad Caseta definition.
Well, from a market perspective, we really sit down with every painting and think, okay, who is the audience that's going to be the most interested in this painting? Is it going to be a Rauschenberg that, really all the contemporary collectors are going to be looking at? Or is it going to be a Julian Onderdonk that, with blue bonnets that all the Texas people want? Or should it go in a regular American art auction? So for us, it's all about reaching the collectors and educating them and getting things out and trying, there are a lot of things that could go either way. It could go in a Western art auction, go in a Texas art auction. Someone like Robert Wood, you'll see him in California, Western, American, Texas, sort of just depends on what the piece is. So like, with most art, it's very subjective. You sit down and you try to figure out for that particular piece where it fits the best.